Good morning to everyone joining us from Europe. Good evening to everyone joining us from Japan. And hello to everyone joining us from any other time zone. The Institute of East Asian Studies in East welcomes you to the second part of our EU-Japan EPA conference. Thank you for being with us today. My name is Dan Wichter, and I'm with the Executive Management of In East. Going beyond the perspectives of our research workshop last Tuesday, today's symposium opens the discussion for evaluating first experiences and further steps of the EU-Japan EPA in action. After short welcome addresses by the Director of In East and the Consul General of Japan in Düsseldorf, we will hear statements from 3 experts in international economics and trade. Their input will provide reference for the following panel discussion with insights from diplomacy, industry, and academia. A moderated Q&A session concludes the symposium. If you wish to ask a question or comment at any time, please use Zoom's Q&A function. And now, without any further ado, to greet you, please welcome the Director of In East, Professor Markus TAUBE.
Thank you. Excellencies, dear speakers, contributors, honored guests, welcome to our symposium today. We are greatly honored and very happy to have the opportunity to organize this symposium, which I think comes at a very timely moment in history and is really addressing something of concern to all of us. This is already the second day of our symposium, EU-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement and Beyond. We want to explore realities, opportunities, challenges of the EPA. I mean, the EPA has already proven its outstanding importance for EU-Japan economic relations and the joint creation of welfare. Concurrently, it appears if it is becoming even more important as with the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, East and Southeast Asia are entering a new stage of economic integration. And EPA might now, in addition to its already implemented functions, provide for a highly valuable link between Europe and the Asian economies that are finding together under the umbrella of RCEP. Before we start with the real content of the symposium, allow me to express my gratitude for their valuable support to this symposium, especially to the Consulate General of Japan in Düsseldorf. Without the consulate, we would not have been able to organize this event. So thank you very much. We're extremely happy to have this opportunity to work with you this time and hope we can do it again in the future. Thank you very much. Furthermore, allow me to express my thanks to the DGAP, the German Council on Foreign Relations, the Japanese-German Business Association, the Japanese Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and of course the Handelsblatt, which all have provided valuable input to this conference, and we are very grateful for their support. But I cannot end this this list of thanks without expressing my gratitude to Werner PASCHA, the mastermind of this symposium. It's been his idea, his approach, his commitment to make this a reality. Werner, thank you very much for doing all this. Thank you. And in the background, Helmut Demes. Without Demes, Helmut Demes, the In East would not work. So thank you very much for everything you are doing for us here. Now, finally, I would also like to express my thanks to all the participants who with their contributions have and will provide the academic and diplomatic substance to this conference. You are actually the carriers of this conference, so thank you very much as well. I wish you all a wonderful morning, afternoon, evening, and I hope that we all will get out of this event a little bit more informed, better informed, and able to make better decisions. Thank you very much and have a good time.
Thank you, Professor TAUBE. And now I ask the Consul General of Japan in Düsseldorf, IWAMA Kimonori, for his welcome address.
Thank you very much. And dear Professor TAUBE, dear Professor PASCHA, dear speakers of everyone who is participating in this symposium all over the world. It is a great honor and pleasure to have an opportunity to address my remarks today on behalf of the Japanese government as Consul General of Japan in Düsseldorf. Having said this, some people might be wondering why I, Consul General of Japan in Düsseldorf, am delivering a greeting. Let me begin by exploring this matter first as an introduction. In 2019, after the Japan EU EPA and SPA came into effect, this conference was being planned in Düsseldorf early this year, hosted by the Research Institute in East, Institute of East Asian Studies at the University of Duisburg-Essen in Germany. The In East is not only renowned for the high qualified research work in terms of East Asian issues, but also famous for the thoughtful messages that they deliver for the various bilateral issues between Japan and Germany, as well as between Japan and the EU. In addition, the In East at the University of Duisburg-Essen, where Professor PASCHA works, is located in the city very close to Düsseldorf, the state capital of my jurisdiction. That is the reason why I speak at the beginning of this seminar. As you all know, due to the widely spread of pandemic, this symposium was obliged to abandon the original plan of on-site event and switch to online one. In addition, the schedule was, due to several reasons, postponed until today in the middle of November. In spite of all those difficulties, I am pleased to take part in the meeting, and taking this opportunity, I would like to extend my sincere thankfulness to everyone involved, among others, Professor PASCHA and Executive Director of the In East, Mr. Demes, without whom this project would not have been possible. As I mentioned, this event was scheduled earlier this year. However, looking back, the postponement of it, I believe, gave us an unexpected but interesting impact to this symposium. Firstly, as was already discussed in the session last week, the discussion will be undertaken immediately after the US presidential election. Secondly, as was mentioned by Mr. TAUBE, this event is held just after the signing of the RCEP EP agreement, which has a strong effect on global economy. Given those significant changes of global constellation, I think it is high time for Japan and Europe to identify common challenges and to intensify discussions focusing on concrete cooperation. The COVID-19 causes tremendous difficulties to host the events like this, but the state of so-called new normal offers us certain opportunities as well. According to my understanding, it might be difficult to gather experts from all over the world for one day under current circumstances, aside from uncertainty caused by Corona. Due to the current crisis, if we are to organize large-scale events in Düsseldorf, we have to face many issues to overcome, such as restriction of travel, assurance of facility under strict control of this infection, and so forth. Although I acknowledge the plenty of merits of direct interaction between the participants, the online event enables us to exchange opinions beyond countries and time zones. I'm convinced that this setting will become one of the standards in the new era after the pandemics. Last but not least, I would like to go back to the point who I am. As was planned, the city of Düsseldorf was supposed to be one of the appropriate venue for this event. If you take a look at the population of the Japanese business people in this city, you can imagine the city is eager to benefit from the amicable cooperation between Japan and Germany, as well as Japan and EU. Moreover, the city is located very central in the continent of Europe. I know there are a certain number of participants and audience from Brussels. The city of Düsseldorf is only a 2-hour car drive from Brussels. Given all those facts, I would like to emphasize that we, the member of Consul General in Düsseldorf, are keen on the outcome of this discussion. Moreover, we are also keen on how it might reflect the future relations between this city and the Japanese community. I wish you all the best for the panelists and participants in this seminar for a lively, future-looking discussion. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Consul General. Our first input statement comes from Professor Langhammer, former Vice President of the Kiel Institute for the World Economy. He has served as senior advisor to the German government, as well as to several international institutions, among them the EU, the World Bank, the OECD, and the United Nations Industrial Development Organization. His statement focuses on the significance of the EU-Japan EPA from a European perspective. Welcome, Professor Langhammer. The next 12 minutes are yours.
Thank you very much. So, very warm welcome and greetings from the north of Germany, very far north, from the Baltic Sea. What I do is, in the next 10 minutes, is to try, first of all, to introduce the changing strategies of the two areas, Japan and the EU, turning bilateral and regional. Second, discussing a few characteristics of the EU-Japan economic relations since 1995, very briefly. Then turning, of course, to the substance, which is the significance of the EPA for the global trading system. Then my proposal, calling the better is the enemy of the good, combining the best of the EPA, CETA, and the CPTPP, and finally a few conclusions. So let me start with 4 introductory remarks. The EU traditionally has been the forerunner and Japan the latecomer in bilateralism. By the turn of the millennium, Japan had 0 bilateral FTAs, the EU 17, the highest number of all WTO members. By April 2020, Japan had 17 and the EU 40 FTAs. What does that mean? That means that both EU and Japan are converging with respect to the view of bilateralism and also regionalism as a complement to multilateralism. As seen from Europe, Japan is a key driver in the CPTPP 11, without the US, and what we call thus an open regionalism, and the recently concluded RCEP, of course, adds to that, though it is only a shallow agreement relative to the much deeper agreements in which we are talking in a minute. Japan is the first country also to conclude a trade agreement with EU 28, as well as with the UK. And given the strong interdependencies between EU 27 and the UK, the European perspective on the EU-Japan EPA should not exclude the United Kingdom. Now, what are the key characteristics? And here I have, again, 4 observations. First, the foreign direct investment, in particular from Japan into the EU, has been more dynamic than goods trade. Japan enjoys a surplus. Why is this important? Well, my view is that the future battleground of conflicts is perhaps more likely to be in the treatment of foreign direct investment than in trade. I come to that later. EU service trade, EU surplus, is mostly supplied by EU exports via so-called cross-border trade, consumption abroad, and movement of natural persons. These are the so-called free modes of supply under the WTO definition, whereas Japan supplies service exports by Japan multinationals in the EU, what we call commercial presence, mode of supply number 3. Why? Again, this is important. If foreign direct investment should become subject to restrictions for reasons of national security. The implementation of the EU internal market for Japanese cars by the end of the 90s of last century left the EU with a very high, relatively high MFN tariff on cars, 10%. The Japan-EU agreement includes now a very important phasing out of the car tariffs over 7 years, and that can stimulate direct trade over horizontal FDI, that means FDI, in the area where Japan sells cars, for instance, in the EU. The Brexit confronts Japan with a high risk of cutting global value chains between EU 27 and the UK. And so, yes, the value of the Japan agreement with the UK is highly contingent on the outcome of the UK-EU negotiations. You know, we are not yet clear what will happen, and we have only a few weeks' time for the end of the transition period by the end of this year. Now, what is the significance of the EPA for the global trading system? Very important, the EPA addresses controversial trade-offs between trade liberalization and non-trade related issues which have remained unsolved in the very vague WTO framework of Article 20 GATT. And such issues encompass sustainable development, workers' rights, the environment, climate change, the dispute settlement mechanism, which includes both experts of civil society and international NGOs, and a commitment, very importantly, a commitment to the Paris Climate Agreement is explicitly given in the APA. In the absence of a global investment agreement linking trade and investments through, let's say, convergence of EU and Japan investment protection laws, the EU would like to, of course, to launch a so-called investment court system, departing from the old ISDS system. Again, this is very important, as we use solving disputes on investment will be very controversial in bilateral economic relations. See the trouble between EU and China on the investment protection treaty, and also with respect in negotiations between the US and the EU. Negotiations on, let's say, how to deal with disputes on investment are not yet finished, but if they would be successfully concluded, they could create the world's largest safe investment area. And that world safe investment data flow area includes so-called mutual recognition of each partner's personal data protection regulations. So the EPA, of course, includes further very important aspects, such as access to procurement markets in subnational constituencies, for instance, cities, liberalization of e-commerce and financial services. Very important for the EU is always a support in small and medium-sized businesses, also very important for Japan. And the EPA is of course embedded into a wider framework of political cooperation with respect to regional and global challenges. You know that this is SPA, the Strategic Partnership Agreement. Now, the EPA must be assessed from the target, again, seen from the European perspective, defending economic sovereignty against IT tech challenges, geopolitically motivated divide and rule tactics from the US and China, negative sum games, that means setting up tariffs on both sides where one partner loses more or less than the other, and of course the guy who loses less is seen then as a winner, which is what we call negative sum games. And Japan could face similar challenges in negotiations with other countries. To leave their footprint in the rising fragmentations of economic relations through setting up new walls, I think, very importantly, Japan and the EU need like-minded partners. And that brings me to my fourth point, what I call the better is the enemy of the good. Could the two partners find like-minded partners? Such a partner, in my view, could be Canada, eventually also South Korea, both linked to Japan via TPP and to the EU via CETA, and of course to the EU-South Korea FTA. The three, let's say Japan, the EU and Canada, could check the agreements on common minimum standards in non-traditional issues such as digital trade, defending intellectual property and workers' rights, personal data rights, settling disputes, protecting the environment, access to public procurement, and supporting SMEs. All these issues are included also in the bilateral agreement with Canada, and maybe also in the CPTPP. Beyond common minimum standards, of course, then each partner would be free to pursue their own regulations. To expand the free partners initiatives towards global areas, of course, and global schemes, Japan and Canada would encourage other CPTPP countries to join them, while, of course, the EU would envisage to set the same target in their bilateral agreements. Now, very briefly to the conclusions. The critical perspective of Europe on the EPA is its suitability for defending Europe's economic sovereignty. Under this target, I see that the EPA is necessary, but not yet sufficient. The EPA could become a core in a wider web of like-minded countries to establish new trade rules beyond tariffs and non-tariff barriers. Such web could have sufficient clout to match aggressive geopolitically rooted bilateralism of the US or divide and rule games of China, both targeted against the EU. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Langhammer. Changing to an East Asian perspective, we now move on to the second input statement held by Professor URATA Shujiro. He is Professor Emeritus of International Economics at Waseda University and has held several research and advisory positions, including senior advisor to the government of Indonesia, consultant to the World Bank, to the OECD, the Asian Development Bank, and the government of Japan. Professor Urata, thank you for sharing your analysis with us for the next 12 minutes.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to join this very important seminar. I'd like to use my PowerPoints for my presentation. First of all, I agree most of what Professor Langhammer has said already. So some of my points are repetition of what's been said by Professor Langhammer, who's a very good friend of mine for a long time. So my points are to discuss the significance of EU-Japan EPA from an East Asian perspective. East Asia here means not only Japan, but other countries. In order to make some points about this very important issue, I'd like to recognize the current status of a world trading system or trading situation. I have 3 points to make regarding current world trading system, which I think is in quite distress. Number one, World Trade Organization, WTO, is facing a number of problems. Number one, almost no progress in multilateral trade negotiation or Doha round, which started in 2001. Very few accomplishments. And in terms of setting new rules, there are some developments being made, but not quite sufficient. And number three is a very serious problem, dysfunction of dispute settlement mechanism. So World Trade Organization is faced with very difficult problems. Number two, we see rising protectionist and market distorting measures. US-China trade war since 2018, it's still on. And then in addition, a number of countries have started to applying, well, I'm sorry, this is a point that I just wanted to make. Application of subsidies in non-transparent fashion, violation of intellectual property rights, protection and forced technology transfer. These are some of the so-called unfair trade practices adopted by countries, particularly by China. But in addition, I'd like to say the number of countries is now applying so-called non-tariff measures like SBS and so on, which are distorting trade flows. And the third problem of the world trading system at the moment is the emergence of growth of new international economic activities, which Professor Langhammer mentioned already, which are not covered by international rules. E-commerce, digital trade, investment, and so on. So these are some of the challenges that we are faced with. And having said this, I'd like to make some points about the very important significance of EU-Japan EPA. First, from Japan's perspective, and then turn to East Asia's perspective. For Japan, EPA, Economic Partnership Agreement, have been very important trade policy measures, particularly since Prime Minister Abe took office for the second time in 2012. Indeed, Prime Minister Abe kind of assigned CPTPP, Comprehensive Progressive TPP, as one of a very important component of his third arrow, which is growth strategy. FTAs in general have been very important policy measures for Japan. And EU-Japan EPA accounts for a very large part of Japan's trade and investment. Again, Professor Langhammer mentioned this, so I'm not going to the numbers, but for Japan, EU has been a very important trading partner as well as investment partners. Number three, EU-Japan EPA has a very wide and comprehensive coverage, and the contents of the agreements are very so-called of high quality. And it has 23 chapters covering many economic activities and high level. Here, high level can be, characterized by saying that almost 100% of the Japanese imports going to EU will be free eventually after some period. And for Japan, not as high as 100%, but still 94%, quite high. And it has clause on state-owned enterprises, non-discrimination from services, investment trade. They adopted negative list rather than positive list and so on. So this agreement is characterized as a very high quality. Now, there are several studies which used the simulation model to see the possible impacts of EU-Japan EPA on Japan and other countries, of course, EU. As for Japan, it is projected or expected to increase 1% of GDP. 1% sounds small, but for Japan, our average kind of growth rate in the last, say, 10, 20 years is very low, 1% or less. So this is quite a big impacts on Japanese economy. And when it comes to the so-called utilization of FTA, it's been on for just a little bit time, but given the short period of time which has passed since the establishment of the EU-Japan EPA, utilization rates has been quite high. And of course, the utilization will increase as time goes on. So again, many companies I talk to enjoy the benefits of EU-Japan FTA by using these FTA preferences. Number 5, EU-Japan EPA has been a very important framework for Japan as a way to establish a good relationship with an important partner like the EU, which shares the common values such as democracy, rule of law, basic human rights, and so on. And of course, EU-Japan Strategic Partnership Agreement is a symbol of that. Now, the last point that I want to make is about the EU-Japan FTA from not only Japan's, but also East Asia's perspective. This is a very important framework to establish an open, free, and transparent rules-based environment. This is very important in light of the fact that the many countries, especially the US and China, are causing problems. So this is very important for not only Japan, but for East Asia. And we'd like to see this agreement to drive a momentum toward the reforming the WTO, or World Trading System, whose problem which I mentioned earlier. And I'd like to see EU-Japan EPA as a step toward the establishment of a larger East Asia EU EPA. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Professor Urata. Our concluding input statement comes from Professor Werner PASCHA, who draws on insights from the preceding research workshop last Tuesday. Werner PASCHA is Professor Emeritus of East Asian Economic Studies with a focus on Japan and Korea at the Mercator School of Management and the Institute of East Asian Studies. Among other functions, he is the Vice President of the Japanese-German Center Berlin and serves in the steering group of East Asia Net, the European Research School Network of Contemporary East Asian Studies. We are delighted to now hear from you, Professor PASCHA. The next 12 minutes are yours.
Well, thank you very much. I hope that the screen is already visible. Good morning, Europe. Good evening, Japan, and a warm hello elsewhere. Yes, indeed. We had a research workshop last week with presentations by 4 leading experts, and I would like to report about it. So the first thing is that I would like to give an overview of the issues we discussed. We discussed the EPA, as has been done by Professors URATA and LANGHAMMER, but then we also discussed the wider sustainable, the wider strategic partnership agreement between Japan and the EU, and the connectivity partnership that is part of SPA and the first concrete outcome of it. With respect to all agreements, and here in this overview, I think our friend Christoph Idingens has tried to visualize it, shared values are extremely important, like freedom, fairness, the idea of a rules-based economic system about which the EU and Japan are united. And there is a number of challenges to this kind of multilateral system that were already mentioned by the 2 speakers before, so I don't go into it. But it's obvious that a deep-rooted trade agreement, including issues of sustainability and many other aspects, is quite timely and important. So on the face of it, the EPA came into force in February 2019. If we simply compare trade figures of 2019 and compare them to 2018, so a very rough measure, we realize that trade has already increased by more than 6% between the EU and Japan. Of course, this is very rough. We cannot extrapolate it into the current period of COVID-19. And there's also the issue of to what extent the success can be attributed to the EPA. I will talk about this soon. The second aspect we discussed is the strategic partnership agreement. And one thing we noted is that this wide agreement covering some 40 political and sectoral factors is based on a trajectory of earlier agreements that have been made between the 2. So Professor Julie Gilson of Birmingham University, who has incidentally just written a book about EU-Japan relations in a multilateral framework, pointed out that in order to learn from these kind of trajectories, but also changes, we could call them plasticities, involves focus. EU and Japan have to focus what they really want to achieve in the SPA, and they need to provide the adequate resources. Well, talking about these kind of agreements, and the partnership on connectivity is the first concrete outcome. Of course, we have to keep in mind the wider framework that is going on in the world, and my the other speakers have already focused about that, so I will not go into that into more detail. So let me just go on to discuss the issues we have dealt with more specifically in terms of the EPA and trade. We had Professor Jens Wroner from our own university, who is a professor for new economic geography, and he informed us about how can we evaluate the impact of the EPA. And the way to start, he recommended us, is to think in terms of the so-called gravity model that is used in economics. So here the idea is that to evaluate bilateral trade, we keep in mind that it definitely depends on the size of the different countries, and it also inversely depends on their distance. Now, with these two factors, which are similar to gravity in space, we can add additional factors, and accounting for all these factors, we can see what importance tariffs and other non-tariff barriers have in order to change trade. And there are a number of outcomes I would like to report. First and very significant outcome is that, talking about Japan-EU EPA, but also about other agreements, many other agreements, the non-tariff barriers are much more important than the tariff changes. The tariffs were actually already quite low, so it depends on this kind of process of trying to handle the non-tariff barriers, to what extent this will be a huge success. There are a number of additional lessons, and let me just mention three. First, negative effects of the agreement on other countries are small. This is very welcome. Secondly, the direct effects of the agreement are somewhat moderate. This has already been discussed by Professor Urata a little, but it shows that the indirect dynamic effects that we hope to achieve from the agreement are very important. And this also means that something more has to be done on investment issues that are still somewhat open, and Professor Langhammer mentioned that already. Third point, the gains for Japan are somewhat larger from the EU than for the EU. This is not a problem of the agreement itself. It simply depends on the fact that the EU is a very large market with some 500 million people. So naturally, access to this huge market has significant effects. Second, we discussed the wider agreements, and there the connectivity agreement between Japan and the EU in particular. And Professor Yoshino Naoyuki, Emeritus Professor of Keio, and until recently the Dean of the Asian Development Bank Institute, told us that we have several problems with infrastructure in the Eurasian continent, and hopefully Japan and the EU could contribute to solving them. Indeed, simply relying on the public sectors of the individual countries to fulfill the infrastructure needs will not be enough. And Professor Yoshino focused on two issues. One is finance. So in Asia, we have a bank-dominated finance system, which makes it difficult to attract enough funds for these kind of huge infrastructure investment. So support from EU insurance companies or pension funds would be much welcome, obviously provided that infrastructure can be defined as its own solid investment class and quality can be safeguarded. The second aspect is that we need organizational mechanisms to improve infrastructure investment, and there one could also profit from the huge Japanese experiences and also European experiences, for instance, creating better organizational mechanisms for land trust, how to go about land use, or public-private partnerships. So if quality infrastructure is assured, and Japan is strongly working on that these days and has a big experience, then wonderful spillover effects can be effectuated in infrastructure, including education and including digital infrastructure, which was the third and final point we discussed. The digital world obviously plays a key role in determining the effects of connectivity between EU and Asia and beyond. And in a way, it's torn between business interests, human-centered interest, also state security-related issues that are defined in different terms in various countries. So based on this, Dr. Maike Okano-Heijmans, who is from the Dutch Klingendahl Institute for International Relations think tank, provided us with 3 ideas or opportunities for joint action in this field. First is act together on platform regulation. Second is standard setting for digital norms. And the third idea is digital development assistance that could be given by a joint effort of Japan and the EU. Now, obviously, with this issue and with others, we have to keep in mind that there are other players in the world, including the US and China. So for platform in particular, both countries have made major inroads, and Japan and EU have to make sure that platform regulation is in our interest as well. Basically, we discussed that for EU and Japan, it's in the interest to follow an inclusive approach, avoiding confrontational stance, be it in the issue of digitalization or elsewhere. So let me close by 3 conclusions that we came up with, and I hope it's a fair summary of our discussions in the research workshop. First, EPA, yes, had been off to a good start. Now the issue of creating these indirect dynamic effects are most important, including handling non-tariff barriers and investment issues. Second, the strategic partnership agreement is a meaningful response to multilaterally emerging issues like infrastructure, and resources and focus will be most important. And the third point, if we talk about the connectivity partnership that has been agreed in September 2019, there are various ways forward, and we discussed and saw opportunities, particularly in the field of finance and digital connectivity. Now, if you are interested, let me just mention this in the video presentations, both of the workshop and of the conference, in the presentations themselves, and also in the graphic images which I provided today and which will also be prepared for this symposium. Please check out our conference website, and you see the address below. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Pascha. We now move on to the panel discussion, which will be moderated by Nicole Bastian. Nicole Bastian is head of the Foreign Affairs Department at Handelsblatt, the leading German newspaper in business, finance, and economics. We are looking forward to a stimulating panel discussion with our esteemed guests. Over to you, Nicole.
Thank you very much, Dan. I'm glad to be here with a very distinguished panel, and I'd like to introduce my panel and start with Shimokawa Makita. He's the ambassador of Japan to Belgium and the NATO, and ambassador for external communications in Brussels. We have with us Nakanishi Yumiko, professor at the Hitotsubashi University in Japan, and at the moment visiting fellow at the Max Planck Institute in Luxembourg. We have with us Marco CHIRULLO. He has been deputy chief negotiator of the EU-Japan EPA, and is the deputy head of the unit at the European Commission responsible for trade relations with Far East Asia. You might add your video, Marco, that we can see you. We have with us Henning SIMON. We see him now. He's in charge of Japan at the Asia Pacific Department at the Federal Foreign Office in Berlin, and also in Berlin with us is Friedolin STRACK. He's the head of international market at the Federation of German Industries, BDI, in Berlin. Thank you very much. For our audience, you might jump in with questions. You see below in the Zoom screen the F&A button. You might add questions there also if you have burning questions to the 3 presentations we saw so far. So perhaps let's start where we heard a lot about the results of the EPA so far. Nevertheless, I'd like to start our discussions with your core takeaways of the results of the EPA so far, and perhaps your main point, what has to be done now. And we start with you, Ambassador Shimokawa.
Well, thank you very much. I'm Shimokawa. I'm very happy to participate in this seminar. I was also present at the research workshop last week. It was very interesting, and it has been very well summarized by Mr. Pascha just a minute ago. I just want to be very short, but without being afraid of duplicating some of the points which has been mentioned, I think it's very important to recognize why the Japan EPA EU matters. And of course, it has been said by the precedent speakers, but this is a model of high standard economic order of the 21st century. And I think this is a framework which represents a very free, open, rule-based, and fair trade. Covers 30% of world GDP, 40% of global trade. And the recent EU report have already confirmed that there was a 5.8 increase in trade in both directions between EU and Japan in 2019. This is before COVID, but I must say. But and also 16% increase of EU export to Japan for agri-food. So this is also a significant increase that we have observed. But I must touch on the second aspect, which is the importance of this built-in mechanism that is provided by Japan EU EPA together with the Japan EU SPA, because under the EPA we have a joint committee, 12 specialized committees, working groups, and in the SPA we have a wide array of area of cooperation, which encompasses about 40 areas. And so if we have some future work to do, including non-tariff barriers or other measures, rules of origin, we can always have this built-in regular mechanism that will be very effective in improving and in making the bilateral framework even more effective. So one of such an example was this discussion about the connectivity partnership. I think there has been very interesting points which has been pointed out in last week's meeting, but there are some problems that we have to overcome. Although there are good intentions, I think putting that in place in reality do necessitate hard work and good will of a spirit of cooperation. And I think this will be one of the most important areas that we will be working on. So this is the general evaluation of the EPA. I just want to touch on 2 more additional points. One is that there has been this discussion about the bilateral versus multilateral. I started my career in a very multilateral world where WTO was at the center of all the trade orders and rules, but we have eventually, as has been mentioned this morning, that Japan have also shifted more to a bilateral or regional meeting framework. But I think we always have to come back to the basics, that the multilateral and the bilateral framework should be mutually supplementary. That is why working together with EU in reinforcing the multilateral framework as WTO is very important, and this should also be the priority area for our bilateral cooperation, i.e. the reform of WTO. Secondly, on the point of the digital economy, I think we are on the same page, going to in the same direction. And as you are aware, Japan is promoting the idea of data free flow of trust, which has been endorsed in the G20 process and the Osaka summit last year. So, and this is about sort of addressing the trade-related aspect of e-commerce, at the same time promoting bilateral and multilateral regulatory cooperation to ensure the safety of privacy and data. So this is something that we can also continue to work on. I stop here for my initial statement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Shimokawa. Professor Nakanishi, moving forward, what would be your core aspects for the EPA to develop?
Yes, thank you. It's an honor to participate in this symposium. I would like to emphasize 3 points. The first, that's legal binding nature and institutionalization. The EPA and the Strategic Partnership Agreement are legally binding. This is very important, I think. They are not simply a political declaration. The EPA is not simply an agreement of cooperation. Rather, the EPA institutionalized the relationship between the EU and Japan to some extent. The EPA established a joint committee of the representative of the EU and Japan. The first joint committee took place on 10th April 2019, according to Article 22.1 of the EPA. The joint committee is held regularly once a year, and the joint committee can take decisions which bind the EU and Japan. There are several specialized committees under the joint committees. The EPA also provides for its own dispute settlement mechanism, which establishes a dedicated panel for this purpose. The second point, chapter on trade and sustainable development. Recently, 5 countries signed the RCEP agreement, but that RCEP does not contain such a chapter for sustainable development. The EPA is a free trade agreement, but has a special chapter for environmental issues. Chapter 16, Trade and Sustainable Development. It refers to climate change, including the Paris Agreement explicitly, as Professor Langhammer mentioned. And it is of note that the chapter provides the participation of civil society. The EU and Japan share common values such as respect of democracy and respect of human rights and the rule of law. The EPA makes participatory democracy concrete in this chapter. The Committee on Trade and Sustainable Development, one of specialized committees, is responsible for the implementation of this chapter. The Committee on Trade and Sustainable Development is established, and its first meeting took place in January 2020. Furthermore, first joint dialogue with civil society was held in January 2020, in which representatives of economic and environment and labor organization participated. And the third point is cooperation in climate change and energy, in particular toward a hydrogen society. In Japan, a document titled Basic Hydrogen Society was approved at the Ministerial Council in December 2018. This document indicates that Japan will lead in a global effort to establish a carbon-free society. Moreover, a new strategic roadmap for hydrogen and fuel cells was formulated by the Japanese cabinet in March 2019. Recently, Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga declared a goal to achieve net zero carbon emission by 2050. The EU now recognizes the importance of hydrogen society. The document, the Partnership on Sustainable Connectivity and Quality Infrastructure between the Japan and the EU of 2019, also referred to cooperation in area of hydrogen and fuel cells. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Nakanishi. Now to the, if we see the results so far, we saw the trade impact on the EU-Japan side. Marco Cirillo in Brussels, is there also a statistics, which of the 27 EU member countries profited most from the EPA so far? And what would be your core points to develop the EPA from now on?
Thank you. Good morning. See me properly and see me and hear me. It's always very difficult to have a statistics member state by member state. But if we look at the results, for example, of the first year of who's gaining from, and therefore what type of exporters are actually benefiting from it, mainly because the first year has seen, I mean, overall, other speakers have already spoken about the benefits and initial results. But if we look, for example, of who has been able to make use of the agreement during the first year, so what we call the preferential utilization rate. So we see that it has been, first to start with, quite high for a first year. More than 50% in the case of EU goods, a little bit less for Japan, but we have to consider that the agreement was ratified in December and entered into force on 1st of February. So exporters had to adjust. And if we look at statistics towards the end of 2019, we were actually much higher than the 50% I mentioned. But if we look at when it comes to wines or meat exports, we are reaching over 90% of the preferential utilization rate. So we clearly in this case talk about agriculture producers, but when it comes to meat, it's as much as Southern European countries as Denmark or Germany or the Netherlands when it comes to cheese. Which is also a very high preference utilization rate, or Poland when it comes to sausages, or again cheeses. So a lot of benefits to start with when it comes on the European side to agriculture, but also chemicals or machineries. And again, these are quite spread around. It's not only Germany and Italy when it's machineries, but it's specialized one. It can be, it is also France, or again the Netherlands, or the Scandinavian countries. So it is quite spread, but it's clear that to start with, the agricultural producers have been able to benefit from day one, and there's a very clear explanation for that. It's you know, when it comes to rules of origin, these are easier to apply to understand for agricultural products because they are. It's very often wholly obtained provisions, requirements for.
I think we have technical problems.
Okay.
You might check your phone again, but we got what you mentioned so far and which areas profited already. And perhaps we move on to Henning SIMON. How pleased are you so far with the EPA, and what should change or improve in the next in the next steps in your view?
Thank you very much, Mrs. Bastian, and good morning to everybody in Europe. Good afternoon to everybody in Japan from Berlin. I think so far, Mrs. Bastian, we have seen excellent achievements and quite a blueprint for other free trade agreements by the EPA. It's sending a strong signal for fair trade, for rules-based order and multilateralism. Of course, it's difficult to draw already conclusions at this time, but I think the first trends we have seen, and which the previous speakers already mentioned, are quite satisfying. German companies and German entrepreneurs so far profited at least last year by 1.1%. I think, like Mr. CHIRULLO already mentioned, other European member states profited a little bit more. But I think that has also to do with a very volatile exchange rate between the euro and the yen. The challenges you asked, and we are seeing maybe for the next months and years ahead, that's already mentioned preference utilization rate. It's quite high, yes, that's right at the moment, but I think it could be higher, and especially German companies are mentioning that the red tape is quite difficult and complicated to deal with. For example, if it's dealing with certificates of origin. A second challenge I would like to mention is the digital trade. I think already previous speakers already mentioned that one as well. Here it's really a question of standards. We have a review clause in 3 years' time. Japan concluded a digital trade agreement with the US, which entered into force by January 1st this year, on the one hand. On the other hand, Japan internally amended its data protection law in June of this year, according to us at least, in a very good direction. But we have these two different ways maybe Japan might move forward in the future if it's concerning data-free protection and data-free flow. And it has to be seen in which direction Japan is moving. So these two points I would like to mention, which you really should look into the future and the upcoming months and years. Thank you very much.
Just for clarification, that could be an additional chapter to the EPA covering digital economy, digital standards?
No, we already have a chapter, but there's a review clause in 3 years' time. And when we concluded the EPA in 2018, there were still some questions open. So, and these data protection standards have increased and developed in the last 2 years. So I think there is quite some possibilities for improvement, at least from a German point of perspective. I don't know how other speakers are seeing that.
We now have the German point from the German companies, from Friedolin STRACK. Would you agree? Do you have an additional points on what could be improved?
Thank you, Nicole. Let me first start by thanking Professor PASCHA and Markus TAUBE for setting up the seminar. It's a pleasure to be with all the colleagues here and honor. Let me just say the economic cooperation with Japan has always been very important for German industry and is of increased importance in the past years. We always had a very close relation with Nippon Keidanren. We planned to do the large Asia Pacific conference of German business this year in Tokyo. We had to do it digital, but we had a very, very strong Japanese presence with the METI minister, with the CEOs of Mitsubishi Electric and NEC Corporation. They were part of our panel discussions and really enriched the discussion and showed that there is a strong will of industry in Europe, Germany, and Japan to cooperate closer together. I also see this reflected in our interest in the EPA. From my feeling, it's too early to really say what the outcome in industry would be, but just let me give 2 hints. The first hint is, and a little, not correction, but addition to Mr. CHIRULLO, I found your analysis very good, and I would like to add that in our industry, I would like to include agriculture in the industry world in the sense that food industry, beverage industry is an integral part of industry. And I would not like to see industry versus agriculture taken apart into two areas. Second, if we look at a similar agreement, the one with South Korea, then we also have the result that we opened a very large market for South Korean exporters and producers, and we gained access to a quite small market in South Korea. But in a total sum, since the South Korea agreement is in place for much longer time, I would say South Korea and the EU producers and exporters had a strong net profit from this agreement. And I expect the same with the Japan Free Trade Agreement, the EPA. I would like to add two more points that I find interesting in the previous debate. The first point is that we have seen Japan's flexibility in signing an EPA with the EU that is top standard, includes reference to digitalization, and includes a chapter on sustainable development. At the same time, Japan is part of the RCEP, and we should, in Europe, we should look at this approach to be more realistic. If we try to shift the same high standard that we apply to the EPA, for example, to EU-Mercosur, what we are trying to do at the moment, we end up frustrating our partners in other parts of the world, and we should be a little more cautious in that sense. I probably stop here. There are many more interesting aspects, especially when it comes to anti-subsidy, state-owned enterprises, and what has changed in recent years in the world economy. There are interesting aspects that we might be able to tackle in different frameworks, as the one that has been presented by Professor Markus TAUBE and Rolf LANGHAMMER, and interesting for the further debate. I'll stop here. Thanks.
As you mentioned the RCEP, I'd like to include one question from the audience. It's from Nicolas Kochelmann from the Center for European Integration Studies. He asks, how do the EU-Japan partnership relate in the context of the RCEP agreement? What does it mean for Japan to compare the partner when it compares the partnership with the EU to that with the RCEP countries? We just heard that the standards are in some parts not comparable. Nevertheless, perhaps we start with the German side. Henning SIMON, now is there a certain rush now and pressure on the EU to conclude other free trade agreements with Asia, or is the hype resulting from the RCEP agreement a little overdone because it's a shallow agreement, like Professor Langhammer said?
Of course, we are welcoming every kind of free trade agreement around the world. I think in the end, companies globally are profiting, and our economies are profiting from free trade agreements. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, of course, we also have to look into standards. And I think our population in Europe is also very much looking into that, be it data protection, be it sustainability, and other questions. So we can't keep that at under the table. So it really has to be on the table. I think we are not under pressure. We are, and Mr. CHIRULLO probably will also mention that we are negotiating free trade agreements with other partners in Asia and the Pacific, for example, Australia, New Zealand, Indonesia, and others. So the EU is active in this area, and I think it's not a competition who is doing more or less free trade agreements. I think in the end the content is the most important one, and I think that's what we should concentrate on.
We heard from Professor Langhammer and Professor Urata suggestions for broader East Asia EU FTA. Is this in any means realistic? The EU has so many problems, for example, in the negotiations with the ASEAN countries in Southeast Asia.
That's still a question for me, or? No.
You might jump in, and then Ambassador Shimokawa will answer also.
Yes, I just wanted to explain some of the aspects of the RCEP, because as you may know, the ASEAN had ASEAN +1 FTAs with all the partner countries in the region, including Japan, Korea, China, India, Australia, New Zealand. So the new RCEP bundles, in a sense, those bilateral ASEAN +1 FTAs, but it does not only bundle the FTAs, because it has new liberalization measures. So that's new. And the second important aspect is that now we have a common rules, for example, for the rules of origin, which means that it will be very helpful for providing or making a new supply chain, a regional supply chain, because we will have a common rule of origin. And this is also a progressive process, because at the beginning, for the accumulation of the definition of origin, you only can count the products that comes from the EPA countries. But then this will progressively be broadened to count on the added value and other aspects. And this will also be in procedure terms. Also, there will be not only a third-party recognition of the origin, but there will be a possibility, future possibilities for the producers and the exporters doing self-certification of the origin of the goods. So this is a progressive aspect. And of course, this is very flexible, as it has been mentioned. For example, the service chapter has both negative list commitment and the positive list commitment. And the positive list commitment countries will have to review the possibility of turning the positive list into the negative list in the future after a few years. So this is a progressive approach that this is taking. And one of the most important aspects of the RCEP is that for the first time between Japan, South Korea, and China, we have a free trade arrangement. And it has an enormous meaning because, for example, the industrial goods, number of industrial goods without tariffs will dramatically increase from, for Japan, for an export to China, from 8% to 86%. And to South Korea, from 19% to 92%. We have been for a very long time trilaterally negotiating between us three for the tripartite FTAs. But maybe this would not have been possible without having the other partners, and where you would have a different calculation of the overall benefit of having a regional FTA. Now, coming back to the relevance of RCEP with the Japan EU EPA, of course, the expansion of any bilateral regional EPA is welcome, but I think first of all we would more or less have to control our level of ambition or level of flexibility as to how we would want to balance what we seek and how we would want to give a flexibility to less developed countries or different types of countries. So of course, we have the transatlantic TPP-11, for which there may be also new memberships in the future. That is maybe will be discussed in the future. But I think this is sort of like a competition or the mutual effect of different networks of FTAs that will ultimately provide a new basis for free trade arrangements and economic partnerships. Thank you.
So, Mr. Simon, I come back to you with a question. Do you see the need of a broader, of broadening the EPA to other countries, or the possibility of it, or is it better to have different bilateral FTAs combining themselves? You know, spaghetti ball is the term the BOJ Governor Corora used a lot of times.
Very interesting question, Mrs. Bastian. I think at the end, probably it's easier for us to conclude FTAs or EPAs with other countries or with other regional organizations like ASEAN, what you mentioned before, and not to combine it or to open it within our EU-Japan EPA, because then you have, it's always getting more difficult, of course, if you have more participants on the one hand. On the other hand, of course, you might argue that we have a even broader free trade area and more companies, more enterprises might participate and benefit from that one. So I think the appetite, it was already mentioned, EU-Mercosur appetite for opening up already existing EPAs is maybe not that high at the moment. In Europe, maybe that might change, I don't know, in the future, but at the moment I think it's would be a little bit too difficult probably.
Friedolin STRACK, you mentioned Mercosur and the need for the industry for FTAs. If you look at Asia, which of the agreements being under negotiation there so far is well, the most important in your eyes? And we talk about Asia and Mercosur, but on the other hand, we have the US next year, perhaps, and a revitalization of the TTIP agreement. So I would be interested in your list of priorities concerning FTAs.
Okay, let me start with any FTA that the EU has with partners in Asia is excellent for German industry because it reduces tariffs, it reduces non-tariff barriers, it harmonizes standards, and it opens trade with mutual recognition of products. That is important, and of course, the bigger the markets are, the more important the FTAs are. This is why Japan definitely is in the top of our list of where we like to see EPAs and free trade agreements. Second, we also, German industry, we profit from agreements and the economic integration that has been mentioned by Professor Markus TAUBE and Professor URATA in the region. So our companies have heavily invested in Asia Pacific. in Japan, of course, mostly in China, but also a lot in the ASEAN countries. And having production in Asia, they are recognized as local players. They produce local content, and they fall into the category of exporting from their production facilities in China, in Indonesia, in Japan, to other RCEP partner countries. So we are directly profiting from such an agreement. And the more of these free trade agreements we have, yes, it makes the world more complex. We have this spaghetti bowl. We all know the best way would be to have a multilateral system in the WTO, but as Professor Urata mentioned, it doesn't really work. What I would also like to highlight, if I look at future agreements and their value, then Professor Urata mentioned that in WTO we are not able to tackle subsidies, and probably this should be an area of increased cooperation between the new Biden administration in Washington, the Japanese administration, and the EU, to come to terms in making strong industry-related rules on transparency of subsidies, and include, and I find this very valuable, that we have a discipline on state-owned enterprises in the EPA. We actually don't need it between Japan and the European Union, but we do have it, and probably it's helpful for the future. It's helpful in times when state subsidies are increasing because of fighting COVID-19 economic crisis. But this also, subsidies plus disciplines on SOEs might be a strong future work program to increase a high standard of a level playing field in industry among those very important markets.
I just learned that Marco CHIRULLO is with us, but not in picture, but he hears us and we can hear him. So I would like to pose the question to you again. What do you think? We had these ideas of broadening the Japan EU EPA, or negotiating a broad East Asia EU FTA. Any chances for that? Good idea. Do you want to start tomorrow?
Well, we are, to start with, we are still working hard on the implementation of the EPA. Let me on these, for example, agree totally with Mr. Strack. There's a lot to be done to make sure that the ultimate beneficiaries of it are the whole sectors of the economy, starting from industry. I was unfortunately the system failed me while I was saying that in sectors such as chemicals, there's been there is great potential, and the industry will progressively benefit from it as long as tariffs, as long as non-tariff measures are clarified, the provisions are well presented and explained to all operators, and issues such as customs provisions and rules of origins are better addressed, which is something we've been working on. Now, on this specifically, I don't see now we have a network of agreements in the region, and we're working on them to expand them, as many speakers have mentioned. And let me highlight that one strategic element of the EPA, which is common to the other FTAs we have in the region, is the promotion of international standards. That is the strategic element of the EU-Japan EPA. We have agreed with Japan to work to strengthen international standards internationally. The most striking example is the automobile sector, but it applies to good manufacturing practices in many sectors. Japan has chosen to go that way with us, and we are spreading that approach through the spaghetti balls, as we mentioned it. Of course, a multilateral approach to that would be better, but through those agreements, we're actually promoting those international standards with all of our members. We have a framework with the whole ASEAN countries. We have all the others, the other partners we're negotiating bilaterally. Is it ripe to?
No, we lost you again, I'm afraid.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
We hear you again.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I'm not sure that now the time would be ripe to have another region-to-region agreement, which would encompass the whole region. But we have the possibility of negotiating the same rules through the network we have. Can we enlarge EU-Japan EPA? For the time being, I've heard the comment on the review clause on digital. We have a good digital chapter, as it was said, but we don't have specific rules when it comes to data flows. We have negotiated in parallel an adequacy decision, which recognizes our systems on data management and protection. This is outside EPA, but it is a contribution. The issue as to whether we will expand and review, add additional rules on data provision, free flow data in the EPA, it's something we are looking at with Japan. We'll be discussing that in the coming months. Of course, this is a sensitive issue within Europe with different positions, and it's not an easy circle to square in a way. But this is on our agenda on both sides. We'll be looking into that in the coming months. We have three years to activate the review clause, so we are well into the times. If on both sides there's the feeling that the adequacy decision we have approved, we have negotiated in parallel, is not sufficient, and we have to go beyond. This will be part of the discussions with Japan. As it was mentioned by a previous speaker, we have an institutional setup, so we will be having in the coming weeks, for example, the committee for the EPA implementation in the area of services, and that's where we'll be discussing that.
Okay, thank you. Now I just see a question here in the chat. Any possibility for? Just give me a moment. Okay. Now this question is probably for you, Marco CHIRULLO, from Shujiro Urata. Any possibility for the EU to join the CPTPP, the TPP 11? Is there a discussion in Brussels about that?
I don't see it. I think no, I wouldn't see that in the short or medium term. Certain elements in the TPP are different from the one we apply. So on some others there's some proximity, overlap of approaches, but I don't see that happening in short term. But all these regional agreements, let's be clear about it. The EU is very welcomes these regional agreements as long as they promote international standards, they promote free and fair trade. So RCEP, CPTPP, they're all good news per se. Also, because they create that level of approximation of approaches, they all promote a degree of openness, which ultimately can be helpful also to unblock at multilateral level the future negotiations, and they also create, open up. They allow those countries which are part of these regional agreements to open up progressively, which ultimately make also bilateral relations or other type of agreements easier, because it's a process. Countries get used to open up, they see the benefits of that, and they want more, let's say. And so it is to I do believe it is to the good of of the international trade governance ultimately. And hopefully, as I was saying, particularly in the WTO, which, as we know, it's part of the DNA of the EU, multilateralism, and that would be the ultimate goal if only we could make it more efficient than it has been in the recent years, and we're working for that.
Thank you. Professor Nakanishi, you have done research on the economic standards the EPA set. If we talk about technical norms, data flow, etc., there is a certain skepticism in the EU that through RCEP, through CPTPP, perhaps there could be a standard setting procedure. Do you see this possibility also in the EPA? What would be the best way to avoid a standard setting coming through CPTPP or RCEP in Asia without any EU influence?
Okay. As I mentioned before, RCEP does not have any chapter that trade and sustainability. That means they are not referred to the labor protection and environmental protection. That is the EU's FTA. All of the EU FTA based on their share value, rule of law and democracy and human rights and environmental law, environmental issues and labor protection. But that is a typical or the characteristic of the EU's FTA with third countries. But RCEP is a comprehensive and very important agreement, but that is not, it's different from the EU's FTA. The members of the RCEP, China or South Korea and Japan and other ASEAN countries, it is very difficult to share common values such as democracy and human rights or the environment protection. Therefore, at this moment, this divergence between the RCEP and EU's FTA will exist, but there are some possibility. Japan concluded the EU FTA, and Singapore and Vietnam concluded also agreement FTA with the EU. That means some Asian country know those standards or those provisions. Therefore, in the future, there could be more convergent between such a RCEP and EU's TPP, I think.
Okay,
Yes.
Thank you. There is a discussion about the dispute settlement mechanism and the question if we need an investment court in the EPA. I don't know actually who best. Perhaps Shimokawa-san, can you elaborate on this discussion? What about an investment court and the dispute settlement mechanism?
Yes. Well, as you know, we have not come to an agreement on the ISDS versus the court system in bilateral relations. We have a standard provision basically based on the ISDS system as far as our FTAs are concerned, and we are not comfortable or not informed enough about how the court would function. Of course, the EU probably have a different experience and different evaluation of the two systems. Of course, the ISDS may have some shortcomings. Some people say that it's not necessarily fair enough or anything, but we are open to different opinions, and I think we can discuss in the future how that can be settled. But in the meantime, we would like to carefully look how the court system will function in the EU bilateral FTAs with, for example, Canada or Vietnam. We have not seen any concrete development as to how this would actually function. So we would also like to learn from that, from your experience and how that will take place. Thank you.
Perhaps Henning Simon, why a case for an investment court, or is that not really the point which is of core value in improving or in developing the EPA from now on?
It is a core question, of course, at least for us. And as the ambassador rightly mentioned, I think Japan is looking into our experience with ISTS, and of course but probably Mr. CHIRULLO can say more about that, because here from Berlin we are one member state and we are not, of course, covering all the 27, but we would be, of course, we are completely open for that. We would support such a mechanism, but I think the question should also be answered by the EU and how it is seen by Mr. CHIRULLO. Thank you.
Marco CHIRULLO, do you want to jump in?
Yes, indeed. There are negotiations formally launched on that with Japan on an investment agreement and with an investment protection agreement with Japan, and they have stopped in practice. They've stalled exactly on the issue of the investment court system. And the truth is that the political debate with member states, with public opinion is such that having an investment court system, the new approach that has been developed in Europe on that, which provides more guarantee for public interests in a way, that is an element which is fundamental, because it wouldn't stand the scrutiny of public opinion and decision makers, and being the member states or the European Parliament. So indeed, we stand ready and very willing to continue explaining to Japan the elements of that. But that has been, for the time being, the problem that doesn't allow to go beyond, and it is politically a must-have in the agreement. We can't go back to the traditional ISDS because that has been ruled out politically in Europe, and I have to say increasingly more around the world, even though important partners are still relying massively on it. So that's where we are. So we'd like to advance, but that is a real stumbling block, which is hard which is preventing us from advancing. I think otherwise, on all the other elements, there's common ground with Japan, and even though of course Japan and Europe are not the countries where there are fundamental problems when it comes to investment protection on foreign investors, but still it's something that would be important for our investors and for Japanese investors too, if we manage to overcome that problem. One issue that I wanted to mention from a previous discussion with on regulatory cooperation, I would like to mention that the EU-Japan EPA has in place a regulatory cooperation committee, which aims exactly at discussing new emerging standards and making sure that, in a forward-looking approach, we are not diverging over time on new standards. We have made a lot of efforts in the context of the EPA, but there's also the strategic commitment to make effort on emerging new IT-related standards so that we don't diverge over time.
Perhaps Friedolin STRACK, the view from the German industry, how important is this standard setting, and do you see the EPA there good positioned for regulatory standards?
Yes, I think the answer heavily relies on how much use we make out of this field. Clearly, if I look at the Chinese initiatives in standardization and the China Standardization 2035 program, we have a very strong initiative from China to be one of the key players in international standard setting. For our feeling in German industry, it would be quite valuable if we use the possibilities we have in the EPA to come to joint standards for the Japanese and the European markets, to include new areas. We are very happy that we have this data agreement between EU and Japan, that we have the mutual recognition that one of the previous speakers has referred to. I'm not sure who it was. I think it was Professor Langhammer, yes, it was Professor Langhammer, that we have the mutual recognition on personal data protection regulation, which is extremely valuable since data and digitalization is core to industry in Germany, in Europe, and in Japan. I would very strongly emphasize this area of standard setting in digitalization, where we need standards where machines and data worlds are connected with each other, and this is the very strong field of Japanese industry and German industry. We in the past 5, 6, 7 years have digitalized our manufacturing processes, and we would profit tremendously if we accelerate the work in this field.
If any one of you wants to answer directly, please do feel free. You do not have to have my permission, so yeah, feel free or raise your hand. And we have one question from Werner PASCHA about the sustainability aspects of the EPA. You mentioned them, Professor Nakanishi. The question is, can the bilateral agreements make a significant impact on the issues like the climate goals in the Paris Agreement? So is a real contribution to be expected from them for the climate goals?
Yes. I think bilateral agreement between the EU and Japan contribute to this thing, the development, sustainable development, in particular the climate change. The EU-Japan EPA is the first first free trade agreement which refer to the Paris Agreement explicitly, and so now, so the Prime Minister Suga expressed it's a very ambiguous, very strong aim to achieve the carbon zero mission, and the EU also is very eager to achieve the carbon neutral society until 2050. So the EU and Japan can cooperate very strongly in this field. So the EPA is a free trade agreement, but that EPA could be a very good tool to achieve that. And the EU and Japan conclude not only the EPA, but also strategic partnership agreement. And the strategic partnership agreement refer to also climate change and energy issues. So both EPA and SPA can work in tandem to achieve climate change or to contribute to sustainability in the world, I think.
Yes, Friedolin STRACK?
I think this is a fantastic outcome if the EPA contributes to climate change, to environmental protection, and also contributes to installing high standards of labor rights. At the same time, I think we should give our legislators in Brussels also the message that we should not kind of give them the feeling that with free trade agreement, Europe tries to fix the problems of the world. And we should give them a feeling that the main focus of free trade agreements should be to enable trade. And definitely we must exclude negative effects on the environment, and we must exclude negative effects on lowering labor standards. But we should not forget that policy tools to enable free trade should primarily focus on free trade, and we should find other policy tools to come to terms with the climate problems that are pressing and that industry is fully in agreement with, that we need solutions, and the same with labor rights where they are not at a proper standard.
Now that Marco CHIRULLO is a little bit directed to you, I guess, also. One moment, Ambassador Shimokawa. Do we need these high standards for further FTAs the EU agrees on? And I guess the Mercosur FTA is one example, but also others, for example, with ASEAN, with the ASEAN countries coming up. So perhaps first, Marco CHIRULLO.
Yeah, we, as it was just said, there is quite of an important trade and sustainable development chapter in the EPA. Not only it incorporates the Paris Agreement, but it also expands on labor rights, and it introduces a fundamental principle, which is which goes in the direction what Mr. Strack was saying, you cannot lower environmental standards and labor standards with the aim of gaining competitiveness. This is a fundamental, clear-cut principle which is in the agreement and which is actually in all our new generation FTAs, trade agreements. Because the truth is, I do agree with the principle that we shouldn't overload the trade boat with too many things, because otherwise we risk that the whole trade policy can't sustain the political weight of all that. But it is true that our civil society is asking us to do trade, business, interact with our trade partners on the basis of our values. And that's what the agreements do. And there's no way back on that. We have done it with all our agreements. We've done it with Mercosur, and that is a fundamental element. And I think we all agree that without a focus on environment, for example, with in the Mercosur agreement, that would not stand the pressure of stakeholders and public opinion, especially given the difficult times with Amazon these days in Brazil. So that is an important part. I think we are fully aware that we cannot solve the problems of the world, and I totally agree with Mrs. Strack on that. And this is our approach. But we need to make sure that our foreign policy and trade policy is part of the overall foreign policy of the EU, is also a way of promoting the fundamental values on which the EU is based. And that has been our approach. With Japan, it has been an easy approach in the sense that we share, broadly speaking, those values. We had a very good first meeting of the Trade and Sustainable Development Committee last year, by which we spoke, we exchanged views on labor issues, on environmental issues, talked about joint initiatives, common initiatives on that. So that is what we've done with Japan, and it's the way forward in all the agreements we're negotiating. There's quite a consistent approach in all our agreements.
Shimokawa-san, you wanted to add something.
Thank you very much. I agree with the previous speakers. We have a very important chapter in the EPA, and we also have the cooperative areas for climate change and maybe also for industrial cooperation. When we were talking about the decarbonated society into 2050, both sides need a revolutionary, innovative progress in decarbonizing the whole society and the industry. So there are possibilities for lots of cooperation, both public and private, between Japan and EU, who are the leading high technology countries. And also in terms of what Mr. Strack referred to, this is also, we also have to be careful on the effect of the free flow of trade and investment. So that is why we are very much interested in what the taxonomy means for the Japanese investment and industrial cooperation, how the carbon border adjustment measures will be formulated and how it will affect our bilateral trade. And so those are the things that the dialogue with a high level of transparency and being briefed on what is going on in EU draws very much attention on the Japanese side. And I think we can profit from the existence of those built-in mechanisms for mutually being very transparent on what will be put in place for attaining the goal of global climate change. Thank you.
Henning Simon, perhaps also your take on this question: how high do the standards for further European free trade agreements have to be? Do we have to be more flexible? Do we have to keep the minimum standards we defined so far?
I think from a political point of view, of course, we should be very ambitious and really try, especially with partners like Japan, with whom we share common values. We have a very, very good EPA here with Japan. So we should be very ambitious, and also in negotiations which are ongoing, for example, with Australia and New Zealand at the moment. Also partners where we share our values. Of course, we should try to really reach very, very high standards, and that's what is also expected by our societies. You all remember with agreement with Canada and how difficult it was to really ratify it in all member states. So we have to include that. We can't concede on our standards, and of course we don't have to overload the trade issues with all these different clauses we already have, but and that's what negotiations are for. We have to negotiate these standards with every third country, with every regional organization, and try to do our utmost to really protect and to achieve our standards and goals. That's not an easy task, we all know that, but that's I think what's our task as diplomats and negotiators.
We have one question concerning the connectivity partnership. I think Professor Langhammer mentioned it, and Professor Langhammer, Urata, and Professor Pascha, please feel free to jump in if you want to add something to the points the panelists did so far. So the question is, for the connectivity partnership, a flagship project would be good to raise awareness. so far there is none. What are the problems, and what could be a good flagship project, and in which region could it be? So who wants to give the first answer to that? Flagship projects. Okay.
Yeah.
Shimokawa-san, thank you.
Actually, my answer will be abstract, but we have in the Connectivity Partnership Declaration of last September the areas starting from the West Balkans, which goes all the way through to Asia, so the Indo-Pacific. So I think people are starting to think about where the best joint project can be found. We have now a memorandum understanding between the EIB and JBIC, the EXIM, and also JICA. And so we have experts who are ready to cooperate and look into concrete projects. But at the same time, I think we should not be too impatient. I mean, because joint project on the spot does necessitate very difficult coordination. And so I think even before going to joint project, we can seek a sort of a division of labor kind of project. For example, in power generation, maybe Japan can finance the generator part, and the EU can finance a sort of the grid part, or this kind of joint in the sense of division of labor. You take the different parts and you are independently cooperating with the different parts of the whole system. So this is the kind of cooperation that often takes place in our experience, in our economic cooperation in Southeast Asia and South Asia. And it becomes always complicated if you start. Co-financing is fairly doable, but if you start talking about procurement or who will be participating and joint contracts, I think that makes it a bit difficult. So of course, without wanting to lower the level of ambition for this flagship project, after having heard the discussion last week, that we should also be very creative in seeking other kind of mutually supportive, mutually complementary, cooperative cooperation projects. That was my comment.
And just area-wise, would such a project be located perfectly in Central Asia, in Southeast Asia, in Africa?
Well, I think, for example, Africa, maybe somewhere, this is where the EU and the European countries are present, and to which we also pay a lot of attention for our bilateral cooperation. And so I think we have, to a certain level, common grounds and experience of economic cooperation in Africa. So that may be a possibility. And I don't know how present the European countries are, for example, in Central Europe, but I think there are different places to be explored for our bilateral cooperation.
Okay, if I look at my clock, we're almost due, and perhaps we conclude with one last round in which you imagine the year 2030, 10 years from now, and perhaps a vision where the EU-Asia free trade agreement has developed until then. Might I start with you, Professor Nakanishi?
Yes. The EPA entered into force in February 2019, and now is 1.5 years past. In 2030, that is more 10 years later. Yeah. Yes, and I think the EPA between the EU-Japan is just a start, not an end of the agreement. The EPA gives us a long-lasting legal foundation for the EU and Japan. So now implementation until 2030 is more and more important, I think. And the EPA has a provision to check and value the implementation of the EPA. And EPA can also have an improvement in the future too. So yes, so until 2030, I will the implementation of the EPA will develop, I think. Thank you.
Perhaps you might give us your vision, Ambassador Shimokawa, where for what we use the next 10 years.
Well, yes, I think the Japan EU EPA and SPA is a product of different elements, competition of different world actors, and also as a result of the dysfunctioning of the global or the multilateral system. But I think we have maybe taken a maximum advantage of the situation to come up with a Gladstone corner piece for Japan-EU cooperation, both economic and political. And I think we will continue to use this opportunity and to further develop our bilateral relationship. It has also very often been said that the Prime Minister Abe have more or less mainstreamed the bilateral relationship between Japan and EU. And I think this will not change in the next 10 years. We will not go back to the international order and the economic order that we have known 5 years ago or 10 years ago. So I think the Japan-EU relationship will continue to develop and continue to be more important, all the more so that the EU is becoming stronger and more influential in the international scene. So we welcome a strong EU, and we welcome a very strong Japan-EU bilateral relationship.
Friedolin STRACK, perhaps you might include in your answer last-minute questions coming in from Rolf Schulze from Japan, considering the future development of the Japanese-German industrial relations and how concepts like Industry 4.0 and Society 5.0 might be combined to create an economic but also cultural synergy between the two countries?
Excellent question. My vision, and I include this last question, my vision for in 10 years, we have heard Professor Langhammer speaking of the rising fragmentation in global markets. Professor Pascha, when referring to the workshop that has been going on last week, you characterized the general trend of renationalization, and my vision would be that we come to more integration in the world economy and not less integration, that we create global welfare through more economic integration, and that we use this welfare for combating the climate change and having more social justice in the world. And I'm quite sure that the competitiveness of our industries and the collaboration that we especially do see ongoing in the field of digitalization, be it with the concept of Industry 4.0, Industry 4.0, or with Society 5.0, there is a tremendous potential for our industries to set a counterbalance to the platform economies that we see dominated by US and Chinese players. And we are specialized in the ones who do the industrial products that are needed in the Internet of Things. And we are convinced that this helps a lot to have the future at our disposal in a way that is beneficial to all of us. Thank you.
Henning SIMON, what are your core points for the development of the trade between Europe and Asia in the next 10 years?
My personal vision would be that free and fair trade, multilateralism, rules-based order will really be the main cornerstone for everybody in East Asia and in Europe. Maybe it's a little bit too utopic, but like we already discussed and previous speakers mentioned, maybe other partners in East Asia who are sharing our values might join into a bigger EU East Asia free trade or economic partnership agreement that has to be seen with very, very high standards on all these different topics we just discussed. Thank you very much.
And last but not least, Marco CHIRULLO, your vision for the next 10 years.
Yes, starting from the assumption that 10 years in global trade is a geological era, but I would say very few rapid points. One, as it was said, will still be finalizing the implementation of the EPA, but that will not be enough. I think in 10 years, I do see a closer cooperation and progress on two fundamental issues that are there on the table already, and which we already speak, is climate and digital. Where for digital, I refer to also elements such artificial intelligence, the risk of authoritarian surveillance societies. All those fundamental elements are elements on which Japan and the EU can work together. We'll have to work together to provide and develop alternative systems to others that could not be in line with our values. EU and Japan share fundamental values on that. They will have to work together to shape the standards of the future. And as it was just said by Simon Henning, we will find allies if we take the lead. The EU and Japan have to take the leadership, lead by the example on those fundamental issues. I'm very actually personally enthusiastic about the recent announcement by Prime Minister Suga. It gives clearly a direction. The EU was already asking Japan to engage on that to the maximum possible. The announcement by Prime Minister Suga paved the way to closer interaction on that already. So I see that in 10 years, but hopefully I see it even earlier. And on one issue that allows me to go back to my old love and love of many in this discussion, multilateralism. We're working together, for instance, on e-commerce in the WTO. Where Japan is leading, is showing leadership, and we hope to make progress on that. That will allow already to tackle the new generation, the real 21st century trade type of issues. I think that's where we will be heading to, and ideally in a stronger multilateral setting, because the standard setting which is happening at regional level or bilateral between us, hopefully, as I said at the beginning of my intervention, will eventually hopefully converge into a revived multilateral governance. And let's see how that goes, and if in 10 years we are right about it.
Well, thank you very much to you, the panelists. It's been really interesting, and also to the Impulse referees, Professor Langhammer, URATA PASCHA, to Professor TAUBE. I think it was a great idea to review the EPA after 1 year, and actually it's kind of kind of a task to do a review again, perhaps in 1 year. I won't promise anything, but it's really a good idea. And for all of you who want to go in depth, the PowerPoint presentation videos and additional information are given at the website where you registered, eu-jp.info. And I think the discussion about the future of FTA and EPA will continue, and we'll speak again. Thank you very much.